So the next page in the printed sewing sample book is the machine sewing practice pattern. Again, the grain line is marked and you have cutting instructions to cut one from muslin. This is for your reference and for your practice, but I will show you how to go about doing this because you will need to know how to follow these lines when you're on the sewing machine. Remember, the grain line is marked, so you can always be sure that you are aligning it to the grain of the fabric properly. So you'll place this onto your fabric parallel to the selvage, pin it in place, measure from the grain line to the selvage, make sure it is accurate, pin it in place, and then you can cut everything at once. I have already cut mine out. If you do not have the paper patterns, that is all right. Just like the hand sewing sample, this is 9 inches along the grain line and 6 inches along the cross grain. So again, 9 inches on grain, 6 inches on cross grain. Now I'm going to map out all these lines onto my piece of muslin using my ruler. First thing I'm going to do, just like we did in the hand sewing sample, I'm going to start from my bottom edge and measure up 1/2 an inch. So that's 4 little squares. And I'm just going to give myself a guideline 1/2 an inch up. From here, I'm going to measure 1/4 inch and keep going and keep going, keep going, keep going until I get to the top of my fabric. So 1/4 inch spacing, make another guideline and another, and keep on all the way up. I am using my Friction brand pen so I can erase these marks when I'm finished. Remember, 1/4 inch is 2 little squares. And the last of these horizontal lines should lay approximately 1/2 an inch from this top edge. So again, 1/2 inch up from the bottom edge, 1/2 inch down from the top edge, and 1/4 inch spacings for all of the lines in between. Now I'm going to join the edges. I'm going to turn my work so you can see that a little bit better. And again, 1/2 inch in from the edge. I'm going to trace this. Now you can start from this edge or this edge. I will be starting from the left edge, and I'm going to connect this first and second line, skip the next one, and connect lines 3 and 4. Every other line, connect those together. So I've joined these two, these, so on and so forth, skipping the gap in between every other one. And then on the opposite side over here, I'll do the same thing, 1/2 inch from the edge of my sample. I joined these two, the first 2 lines over here, so I'm going to join lines 2 and 3 over here. So I'm alternating. I'm going to skip this first set of lines and join the next, and so on and so forth, skipping every other one. So I have created a similar shape to what I have here, where this line is starting here, goes all the way across and back down. It's just a back and forth kind of snake-shaped line. So I've got the same thing transferred onto here, going across and down, back and forth. Now I'm going to take this to my sewing machine. All right, I am over at my sewing machine. I'm just going to turn this on, and I have my muslin sample here. I'm going to start on one of these ends where I've got a loosed edge. My machine is already threaded. I have my top and bobbin thread ready to go. I'm going to use my knee lift to lift up my presser foot and place my work underneath. And you can see that I have centered my line that's on the muslin with the center of my presser foot. So it is lined up there. I can see where my thread is coming down to meet my fabric. Now I'm going to stitch all along this line that I've already marked till I get to the end. I am going to practice back stitching as well. I'll show you how to do that. I'm going to put a little bit of pressure on my foot pedal. I'm not pressing down with my foot pedal, just enough to put a little bit of pressure on the machine. I've got my right hand on the hand wheel, my presser foot is down, and I'm going to turn my hand wheel towards me to drop the needle. And I'm going to keep turning that wheel, let the feed dogs do their job. That's one, that's two stitches, I'm happy with that. I'm going to bring my needle back up, and without moving my fabric, I'm going to take my left hand, place that on my reverse stitch bar. You can see the machine kind of engaged to do reverse stitches. And again, I'm turning my hand wheel towards me, and you'll see the machine start to stitch backwards. So again, I will do 2 stitches back. So I've just done 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back. That is enough for a back tack. That will get you secure stitches at the start of your work. Now I'm going to put my foot down on the pedal and continue sewing. As I get towards this point, I'm going to slow down. I'll raise my foot just so you can see what I'm doing. I'm getting close to this little foot, this little corner here, so I'm slowing down my stitches. You'll notice as I raised my foot, I made sure that my needle was in my work. This is very important with what we're about to do here. I'm going back to my hand wheel, just have my foot rested on the pedal. I'm not pressing down on it, just enough to loosen up the machine. And I am walking my stitches. Walking your stitches is when you just use the hand wheel to manually move your fabric and to manually operate the machine. I'm a little bit off. I'm not quite at that corner yet. Let me zoom in so you can really see that. Again, my needle is down in my work, so when I lift my foot, my fabric isn't going anywhere. If at any time you're in the middle of a seam line or stitching and you want to check something, or you need to raise the foot to reposition something, make sure your needle is down in the machine. As I raise this up, you can see here's the point where I need to be, and my needle is just about 1 millimeter away from that. So I'm going to hold my fabric with my left hand, turn my wheel. I've left my presser foot down. I'm turning my hand wheel, and as it gets close to that point, I want to make sure that needle descends right into that point, and if I need to adjust my fabric, I will do that to get as close to that point as I can. I think I'm a little bit past it, but this is good practice. Now, as I had been doing, I've been raising my presser foot using my knee lift, but I've been keeping the needle down. And as I mentioned, you can do that and your fabric isn't really going to go anywhere. It's just going to pivot around the needle, which is exactly what I want to do now. I'm suddenly having to turn my stitches to go in this direction, but I can't change the position of the needle. I can't turn the needle, but I can turn my work. I can pivot my work around that point that I've drawn in my sample. Now I'm going to take a few stitches and try to get to this point. Again, I'm on my foot is just resting on the pedal just to give it a little bit of pressure. I'm using my hand wheel to manually operate the machine. And I'll get as close to that point as I can. It's not perfect. I'm about 1 millimeter off, but that's why I have so many of these lines to practice with. I am stitching on a number 2 stitch. You can practice with longer and shorter stitches. And you can see I'm pivoting my work again. Get accustomed to doing this because you will be pivoting your work a lot. Make sure when you pivot, your needle is in your work. You lift your presser foot. You pivot the fabric around. Here I've got my fingers. I'm going to tilt it around until the direction I want to sew in is in front of my needle. Lower your presser foot and continue sewing. Again, I'm getting close to the end of my work. I'm now going to switch to my hand wheel and walk my stitches. And as I get close to that point, get as close as I can, right into that point. There we go. Sometimes you have to manipulate your fabric a little bit just to get your needle to lay where you want it to. Again, I'm going to pivot around this corner. My needle is in my work. I'm going to lift my presser foot with my knee lift and pivot my fabric until the direction I want to sew is in front of my needle. Lower my presser foot, walk my stitches. Getting pretty close. There we go. Again, I'm going to pivot, needle is down, presser foot comes up, fabric will tilt. I'm going to pivot my fabric until the direction I want to sew is in front of my needle and keep on going. And this is what we'll do for this whole piece of fabric. This is also a good opportunity to experiment with using your presser foot as a seam guide. You'll see that my seam is about 1 millimeter away from the furthest left edge of my presser foot. Get accustomed to utilizing your presser foot as a seam guide. There will be times when you cannot see the seam guide that's sitting underneath here, and sometimes you need to use your foot as a seam guide. You know that the 2 edges of the feet are going to be parallel to the direction of the stitches as long as your foot is properly installed on the machine and that the screw holding into place is nice and tight. You can always use the edges of your presser foot. You can also use the internal edges of your presser foot along this line inside here, this side of the toe, and the inside of this toe. These can also act as seam guides. So get accustomed to seeing where your fabric is, where your marks are, where your previous stitches are in relation to the edges of your presser foot, and where your needle is in relation to the edges of your presser foot, because you're going to need to do that pretty often in some of the samples we're going to be doing. Again, I'll just lift my foot, making sure my needle is down, pivot my work, drop my foot until once I'm in the position I want, and then walk my stitches. So this is just practice for you, so you get accustomed to the pivoting technique. Again, needle down, foot up, pivot, foot back down, and then sew. Let me show you something. I'll get to the other end and I'll show you something really quickly that you'll need to know for future samples. Okay. So take a look at the stitches I have here. These are my number 2 stitches. That is the most common stitch length. A number 2 stitch, close to 2 millimeters. Again, stitch length is most commonly denoted in millimeters. So a number 2 stitch, you can see how long each of these stitches are. I'm going to switch the stitch length on my machine right now. I'm pressing my reverse lever down halfway and turning my stitch length dial. And it is now sitting at a number 1. Now as I sew, you'll see the stitches are going to be a little bit different, but watch how much precision I can get while trying to get to this corner here now that I've got a smaller stitch length. I can get much closer. I have a lot more control. My stitches are much smaller. You can see really briefly here. Here are my number 2 stitches. Here are the number 1 stitches. They're much tinier. Smaller stitches provide much more precision, especially when going around corners. And you'll need to know that for our future projects. I've just pivoted. I'm pretty happy with the position of my needle in that corner. I took 1 extra stitch and I think I'm right on the money there. I have my needle down in my fabric, lifted my presser foot with my knee lift. I'm going to position my fabric, drop it again, and then I'm going to stitch across. I'm actually going to use the foot pedal for this because smaller stitches, not only are they more precise, that'll run your machine slightly slower as well. It's going to feel like the machine is going slower only because it isn't feeding the fabric through the machine quite as fast. And again, getting close to that point. I think that's right on the money. Yep, that's pretty close. Needle is down, presser feet are up, pivot around, and keep going. Now I will continue with the number 1 stitch for this little bit, just for a few stitches, and then switch back to a number 2 stitch, pressing down my reverse lever and turning my stitch length dial to 2 again, and I'll continue the rest of this with the number 2 stitch. And again, I'll go back to a number 1, pressing my reverse lever, back to a 1, stitch into that corner, needle down, presser foot up, pivot my work, stitch down this side, needle down, presser foot up, pivot again, and down this side. Stitches aren't as accurate as I would like, and I'll show you them when I am finished. Switching back to a number 2 stitch, and I'm going to keep going. So you can change your stitch length while you are sewing, so long as you're not pressing the pedal down. You don't want the machine operating when you change the stitch length. That would require more dexterity than I think most humans are capable of. Make sure when you're changing your stitch length, you stop operating the machine, you change the length, and then continue on with the operation on the machine. I'm going to continue with the rest of this, and I'll show you my results. Again, this is just practice. I'm going along my last line of stitching, but I want to show you something that's important to note when you're sewing on a sewing machine. Let's say you run out of bobbin or your thread breaks or something. I'm just raising my needle using my hand wheel. I'm going to lift my foot and take my work out. Again, this is for demonstration. I'm going to trim my threads, top and bobbin threads. Place my threads back under my presser foot. So let's say you're in the middle of stitching and your thread breaks, or you run out of bobbin thread, or something happens and the stitch gets interrupted. When you're working on a top stitch, a stitching that is visible to the wearer on the outside of the garment, then you might have some troubles. But most seam work that we're going to be doing in garment construction is not seen by the wearer. So if you're sewing a seam or you're sewing an understitching, we'll talk about understitching a little bit later, but unless you're doing a top stitch or something, if you're working on a seam, this is not the end of the world if your stitches get interrupted, your seam line gets interrupted. What you'll do is, just as I did, trim off your extra threads on the back and the front just so you have a nice clean finish. And then once you fix your machine, you rethread it, you get a brand new bobbin on there, you can just put your work back where you started and place your needle a few stitches back from where the seam line abruptly ended. So I'm going to place my needle somewhere back here, about 3 stitches back. I'm just going to slide my fabric in there, and using my hand wheel, I'm going to lower my needle. I still have that presser foot up. I still have my knee lift engaged. I'm just going to use my hand wheel to lower my needle exactly where I want it, lower my presser foot, and continue stitching. I'm not going to back tack or anything. I'm just going to keep stitching on top of the original stitches that were there from when my machine, quote unquote, messed up. And just going to finish this last line of stitching. As I get near the end of this, I'm going to back tack again, just like we did in the beginning. I'll get to the end of my stitching, take my last stitch, taking my left hand and placing that on the reverse lever, turning my hand wheel towards me, and I'm going to take 2 or 3 stitches back. There we go. Sorry about that. And if you wish, you can stitch forward another 2 or 3 stitches, but going back those 2 stitches is usually enough. It is up to you whether you want to take 2 more stitches forward, but that is more than secure, coming all the way to the end of your stitching and back stitching 2 stitches. I'm going to look at my take up lever, make sure it's all the way up. That way I can remove my work. Always have a pair of snips or scissors handy, because the industrial machines do not have automatic thread cutters. You will need to cut the threads manually. Now I have finished my sample, gone all the way through. I'm going to trim off my threads from where I started, top and bobbin thread, and I'll trim off the threads where I ended. And I'm going to trim the threads that are left over from where I repaired my stitching here. This is perfectly fine when, again, you're working with internal stitches that the user usually will not see. Oh, if I can get this to focus, that'd be great. There we go. So you can kind of see where the stitches have overlapped. It's a little bit thicker in this area, but by stitching over the original line of stitches, this will reinforce the stitches and they're not likely to come out. This is perfectly fine for repairing stitches when you're working in the middle of a seam or something like that. You can absolutely trim your threads and then just overlap your stitches by about 3 or 4 stitches. Please remember that. I'm going to take my work to the iron and get rid of these extra marks, and I'll show you what it looks like. Over at my ironing board, here is my sample, and you can still see the marks left over from my friction pen. I'm just going to grab my iron. Oops. Iron over that, and you should see those marks disappear. So that's what it looks like from the front. I know it's the front because I have black thread on the top of my machine, so this was the side I was stitching from while I was on my machine. And the back has white bobbin thread. You're welcome to use 2 different threads if you like, if it helps you keep track of the top and the bottom of your work. But remember, this is just practicing the pivoting. You can see in some of the areas, let me flip this back over, where I changed stitch length to a number 1. I had a 2, switched to a 1, went around these 2 corners, switched back to a 2, and went back out. Same thing over here. I didn't do so great here, so I think I did better with the number 2 stitches than the number 1 stitches, but this is why we practice. Now, why might you need number 1 stitches? As I mentioned, precision sewing. It tends to lock the stitches in tighter, and it gives you a lot more dexterity when you're getting into tiny little tight corners like this. The disadvantage of smaller stitches, however, they're much more difficult to remove. Sometimes these are used as reinforcing stitches, and we'll be using those later in one of our samples. But do know that even if it seems like the machine is going slower, only because the fabric isn't being fed as quickly, these stitches are much more difficult to remove. So a number 2 stitch is secure, tight, and is easier to remove.